Hey everyone, good afternoon for most of you, good morning for some of you, and welcome to today's webinar, The Next U.S. President, hosted by Omnicom Public Relations Group and Logeion, the Dutch Association for Communications Professionals. My name is David Gallagher. I'm the president for Omnicom PR Group in Europe, and I'll be moderating the first of two panels today. Now, I hope everybody present here has accepted the fact that Joe Biden is going to be the 46th president of the United States, thus concluding the 45th president, Donald Trump's term. It also means that we're going to have a new set of policies and politics to try to understand, try to anticipate, and try to start planning our own communications around, both in the Netherlands, across Europe, and in the United States. Now, in the interest of disclosure, I am not a neutral party. I worked pretty much for the last 4 years to see something like this transpire, but I will try to be neutral in today's discussion. We've got two panels today, first featuring a group of friends and Americans to look at this from the American perspective, all savvy Washington insiders, two from the Netherlands, one in Washington, D.C. right now. And then we'll have a second panel moderated by my OPRG colleague, Jacques Bettelheim. That will be in Dutch, and that will look at the implications for a Biden presidency in the Netherlands and in Europe. We want as many of you to have the opportunity to ask questions and make comments to the conversation in general and to each of the presenters. So hopefully you see the chat feature in your dashboard. And I would just ask you to start asking questions as soon as they pop into your mind. We'll actually address them in the second half of the conversation just to keep the flow going. And we'll get to them just as quickly as we can. So for the panel that I'm moderating, obviously in English, we're joined by Carolyn Behringer, a friend. She is the managing director at UpShift Strategies, which is a consulting firm based in Washington. She resides in the Netherlands. We collaborate on some projects, and I'm very glad to have her with us. We're also joined by a colleague from an Omnicom consultancy, very well-respected Omnicom consultancy called Portland Communications. That's Noah Black, where he's partner and general manager for North America, sitting in the heart of it all right now in Washington, D.C. And then on my lower left, I'm not sure how he appears on your screen, Justin Kissinger, who's a global director of public policy for Heineken International, sitting, I presume, somewhere in the Netherlands right now. I think if it's okay, I'll go straight to you, Caroline. And you and I, our backgrounds have crisscrossed a little bit. I know you were a volunteer, or you worked for the Obama campaign in 2012. I was a fundraiser for the Obama campaign in 2008. I'm sure I saw your name on occasion before we were able to meet in the Netherlands. I know you went on to work for the administration, I think at EPA, and then you went to work on the Hill in two different capacities for Congress. So you've seen how this works, how transitions work, and how new administrations get started. Ask the big question: what do the first 100 days look like in a new Biden administration?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for inviting me to join this really interesting panel. First, I think it's helpful to lay out some of the dynamics that are going on right now. So as everybody's already started to see, it's not going to be a peaceful and orderly transfer of power. Trump will go ultimately, but not quietly. And as you've seen, he's already started denying Biden access to key national security and economic security briefings and preventing him from coordinating with key agencies in advance of taking office. This will and already has prevented Biden from hitting the ground running quickly in January when he's inaugurated. So in the Senate, we have Mitch McConnell, and whether he's majority leader or the minority leader in an evenly divided Senate, he's going to do everything in his power to block a Democratic agenda. He did it under Obama. He's already vowed to do it again under President Biden. Biden, to his core, is an institutionalist. He's been in the Senate for nearly 50 years. And so what we expect from him is to work within the institutions and not come with big transformative change and blow things up. Despite the efforts of Trump and the Senate over the past few years to kind of disrupt the way that Washington works, Biden's going to work very much within Washington. Unlike past presidents, Biden will have no honeymoon. Someone said on Twitter on election day, today is the least disappointed you'll ever be in Joe Biden. And I think that that's going to hold pretty true for all sides. Besides taking over in the middle of multiple crises, he's going to feel pressure from progressives who don't feel like he's going far enough, from moderates who fear that he's going too far, and then from Republicans who are just seeking to block everything he does. And then finally, Trump isn't going anywhere. He's going to leave the White House, as we discussed, but he's still going to be the center of gravity for the Republican Party. He's a big part of the reason that on Election Day, even though he lost, the House picked up Republican seats and the Senate maintained, we'll see the outcome, but a sizable chunk of the Senate. So given those dynamics, what do we expect that Biden can get done on a policy front in the first 100 days? Despite the unprecedented obstruction from Trump during the transition, Biden has already begun to craft his policies and introduce personnel options. And so just this week, he's announced his chief of staff choice, and he's announced a panel that he's going to nominate to deal with the COVID crisis, a panel of scientists. His first priorities, of course, are going to be getting COVID under control, getting the economy back on track, and then dealing with some of the divisiveness from the past 4 years. And then with a divided government, we'll really only be able to pass a more modest legislative policy agenda. So kind of small tweaks to the tax code, a modest green infrastructure bill maybe, and a modest stimulus bill. So he can say goodbye to the massive stimulus packages, climate policies, healthcare overhauls, et cetera, that we really had hoped for while he was campaigning. He'll have to lean heavily on executive orders. It's going to be one of the main ways that he gets things done during his administration. And so some of the things that I think we can expect to see are him rejoining pretty quickly the Paris Climate Accord and the World Health Organization, repealing the Muslim ban in the U.S. that's prevented people from Muslim predominant countries from traveling to the United States, reinstating protections for children of immigrants in the country, environmental protections that Trump's rolled back, and then making it easier for people to enroll in our healthcare plans. So those are some of the dynamics that I think we'll see at play and some of the policies that I think we'll see him roll out pretty quickly.
You know, I'm glad you brought up the executive orders, and maybe at the risk of saying something that's obvious to our viewers, because by the way, I don't know about what your experience was like dealing with your Dutch and European friends, but during the election, especially in the last few days before it was called and after it was called, I was really blown away at how much people know about the Byzantine American election system. People were correcting me on my assumptions about Texas District, 23, and how that might look versus last year. So I don't want to say anything to anybody that's too obvious to them, but just to kind of draw a line under where we are right now. The House remains in Democratic hands, not quite with the gains that they hoped for, but firmly Democratic. Obviously, we're assuming Biden and Harris will assume the reins of the executive branch. And then we have a special situation in the Senate where, bizarrely, 2 seats are up for a special runoff election in early January. And that does, it throws into question who controls the Senate if they win one or both of those seats. But it also kind of extends the politics of this election for unbelievably another few weeks before we actually can draw some firm conclusions about that. And I think the reason I bring this up is because rather than assuming we can things can be done legislatively, the president may have to rely on executive orders, which have been called into question both under the Trump administration and even in the Obama administration. So I just wanted to draw a line on that. I might go to you next, Noah. It's kind of surprising to me it's not surprising that the divisive nature of this election, its impact on the U.S. But in some ways, it's a little weird because Biden looks on a track to have won this election by a larger margin than any president since Franklin D. Roosevelt. So this isn't a squeaker by any metric, and I don't think it's going to be a squeaker even in the Electoral College. Yet the country seems split 50-50, and that has to have some sort of impact, and you must be feeling that in Washington. So I know you give lots of great advice to companies, to NGOs, to government agencies about how to anticipate and understand what's going on with the public in the U.S. So what sort of conclusions do you draw about this election, and where do you think things are headed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest challenge is it's hard for pre-election polling or really even any polling and modeling now to give you actual foresight or confidence. I think that's one thing, you're seeing the Foxes and the New York Times and CNN and the major polling institutions, trotting out their experts now because this is now 2 presidential elections in a row where models haven't matched election day results. And some of that you can give to the margin error, and in some of these points to things like that. But some cases, the models are just simply off. In terms of actual voting, as you said, President-elect Biden is going to win by likely over 5 million votes. Electoral College, he's up by 76 Electoral College votes now. Will be close to probably 100 when it's all said and done with electors. So despite lots of hand-wringing and what we're seeing is maybe denial, it's a decisive win at the macro level. But when you drill down, and I think this is what lots of companies and institutions and foreign governments are looking at, is that you can't simply look at it at the macro level anymore. And state by state, there were no Biden wins in Florida or Ohio, which is something that people had talked about with maybe some cautious optimism. There was talk about flipping Texas maybe, or at least turning Texas legislature. Lots of resources, dollars, peoples, lots of hope went into these things. And for Florida, I think in particular, sort of on election night to go so quickly, I think was part of this red mirage that's washed back. But I think it does call into question sort of where resources are spent and where it goes from there. In states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, this 5 million national margin of victory isn't really reflected there. Wisconsin was looking at maybe 5 or 6 in some cases 8 points. At one point, Michigan was much larger than that, but lots of the experienced political hands on the ground were saying it's getting much closer. I think even from those pessimistic predictions, it was even closer than we had. It's broken down into tens of thousands of votes in some cases, across the board, less than 1% margins of victories. Georgia's obviously a different thing, and we might get into that in some of the Q&A in terms of what the optimism, what that shows. But I think there's great concern even with all the final counting in Pennsylvania and what that means going forward. And for folks that have probably been following on YouTube, the Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania has been really vocal in being out there and sort of both talking for patients, but also talking about what this means for the future and what it needs to reflect. This is an election where, lots of models also had it slated for being transformational at the local and state level. And, for our international friends and colleagues, this is important because it determines how congressional representation and voting takes place over the next 10 years. This is a realignment of congressional districts. And we definitely didn't see this at the local level. We actually saw the reverse of what people thought. Places like New Hampshire are going Republican. Texas was not even close at the state level in terms of what the state legislature wants. So this is a case where lots of voters chose not to penalize Republicans for either backing Trump before or even just appearing on the ballot with him. And I think there was a lot of optimism around what that could have meant for the party, and because of sort of this contracting at the end where it goes. I think 2 things to take note of as well is 5 states passed laws to legalize marijuana. That may not be profound. It may be profound, but I think it shows a trend. This adds to a number of states that have decriminalized. But for voters to proactively go to the ballot box and send that message, I think, is something that we may see a realignment around. Obviously, cannabis business globally is changing, but I think that's a sign from America. And then Florida, with a Republican governor, 2 Republican senators, and a pretty decisive go for Trump on it, has raised its minimum wage to $15 an hour, so showing that you can't necessarily link social policy with it. This is a state that has also been pretty aggressive in limiting healthcare benefits from a state level, but for them to sort of go from the economic standpoint, I think it's interesting. So yes, it's hard for you to sort of take confidence in the polls and models, but when voters actually show up, you see there's some clear messages around that. And then on these referendums, I think you can really dig in some more.
I agree with that, and I think that's a good assessment. Just taking advantage of you being on the ground there, I want to ask you, I'll ask you 2 follow-up questions, but I didn't warn you about either one, so you can choose which one you feel most comfortable with. But before I do that, I would just remind our viewers that it's allowable for you to ask questions now. We will get to them, I promise. So if something Caroline or Noah has said, or that you hear from Justin, sparks something that you either want to challenge or need a little bit more clarity on, please put your question in the chat box, and we'll make sure we get to it. But you mentioned polling early on, and I saw a lot of the commentary about how the pollsters got it wrong again. I don't know that we know enough to know that right now, and I think that we're still kind of parsing results. I wonder if you have any views about what this suggests or doesn't suggest for polling. So that's one thing you might think about. And then it's, we were joking about this earlier, but it's actually not that funny. And there are people who are talking seriously about whether what's happening with the Trump reaction to and non-concession to the election results, are other Republican leaders just humoring him, as they say, and letting him sort of slowly climb down from this, or is this a coup in slow motion? And I don't think we can have a complete discussion without actually addressing what people across Europe are seriously asking me. So if either of those are appealing, and of course I'll come back, Caroline and Justin, if you have a point of view on that, happy to come back.
Yeah, let me take the second one just really quickly, which is I think we're seeing an inverse reaction to what's happening as the results become the margins go wider for President-elect Biden. You're seeing more people reject them, our standpoint, or at least people, a smaller group of people becoming more set in their ways. And I won't try and tap into the psychology of elected or re-elected senators who have clearly liked their election results, but don't necessarily like other results as to why that is. But I think, there was, I think it was the executive editor of the New Yorker who sort of ran out the whole list of things that people said, well, Trump will never do this, Trump will never do that, or that will never happen. And, we're down in, 600 or 700 of those things. So I think there is a vigilance that needs to be rounded. And for folks that are watching, I mean, there's a lot of concern right now just in the micro steps that have been taken around the Department of Defense and some things that have gone around about NSA and DOD that take on to that. And then just quickly on the polling, I think, what it is it's talking to people around this, it seems that the models are basically off, which is for people that aren't experts, it's basically, whether you're undercounting or overcounting or representing certain segments. And it's clear that Trump voters were undercounted, or Republican voters or likely Republican voters were undercounted in states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, where you had large margins. And then related to that, it's just the method of how it happens, which is if you're enthused about this election and you really want to get President Trump out, you're going to probably say yes to that poll. While if you're sort of on the fence or you don't want people to know about it, you may not participate in the poll. So I'm sure others have good insights on that, but that's where I am sort of on.
Yeah, fair points. Caroline, did you want to weigh in on either of those questions?
Just building off of what Noah said on the first one, where he wasn't willing to opine on the thoughts of elected leaders, I'm gonna give it a shot. I mean, just building off of my introduction, Trump is still a very popular person, and his family is, and in many cases more popular than a lot of Republican elected officials. And so I think what we're seeing is that a realization from a lot of folks that they are still going to need his support, that he's not going anywhere, and they're trying to still maintain his support for the next 4 years, because I think they're going to need it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So I want to go to you, Justin, next. And I know you're wearing a corporate hat at Heineken, but I know you're not a political novice, and you were counsel to the House Democratic Caucus, and I think you had other roles on the Hill or Washington as well. So maybe if you can use your political grounding as a filter, but kind of give us your views on what the various stages of the transition look like, and then any policy implications you see for corporates.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you also for having me. This is great to be part of this conversation. It's the most interesting presidential election of my lifetime, and I'd wager any lifetime. So great to be talking about it. Yeah, I guess I see this unfolding in a few different blocks of time that are going to be very distinct from one another based on the political circumstances. You have this transition period where we awkwardly have like a president and a half, and it's not really clear who's doing which policies and how that transformation and transition is going to happen. And while the politics, the presidential politics work themselves out between Biden and President Trump, there's some real priorities that need to get done during this lame duck period. Not the least of which is figuring out what's going to happen on the economic stimulus in the United States, the expiration of all of the relief policies that were put in place in the spring, and then sort of underneath that, we have government funding, which is going to last on December 11th, and at least theoretically shut down the government. So as you're looking at this next period, what businesses, what people who are interested in the process need to be aware of is those are like the big pieces of legislation that are going to guide what happens. There was a lot made in the Washington press about sort of the farce of the negotiations on stimulus benefits heading into the election. I think that dynamic has shifted quite a bit. And what seems clear is that Senator McConnell is going to lean into those negotiations much more directly from here, and that that the ambitions of on the numbers for that package are likely to be much lower than they were heading into the election. At least if the original position of Senate Republicans is where they're starting from. So you're going from something that the House started at $3 trillion in the summertime down to something that's probably closer to the hundreds of billions or trillion dollar range, which is still a lot of money, but far smaller than what I think House Democrats were hoping for at the beginning. All of this in the context of a president who may or may not willingly accept the fact that he's lost, but still will have to sign any of that legislation, still will have to bless a deal to fund the government going forward. So I suspect that that'll be a big moving target, and a lot of the lines that you saw going into the election will be the same as what people are negotiating over, much more in terms of magnitude than in terms of policies. Looking out a bit longer, you're going to have this transition on January 20th, and I guess I've learned my lesson not to prognosticate too much on the outcome of American elections, but it certainly looks like the odds are on divided government coming out of all of this, and a thin Republican majority. And I agree with Caroline's analysis that means that very little transformational is going to happen. She used the word modest. Businesses might use the word stable in terms of federal policy. So it's a lot of question of perspective. I think that Biden will definitely use the executive pen to drive his policy arrangements. So there's some industries that I think are going to need to be more on point for major policy transformations. I'm thinking industries like technology, which has obviously been in the crosshairs of both parties over the last couple of years, but also banking, which is a Democratic focus. And then climate change is going to be something that I think the Biden administration wants to accentuate wherever possible. So driving climate conscious elements into policies across the federal government, not just the environmental beat, so fossil fuels, but also things like housing, things like insurance, things like financial services, the systemic risks that they think are associated with climate change. A lot of those elements, I think, will start to come through in policies across the pitch. The infrastructure may be an area where you get some agreement. There's some relationships that Biden's going to be able to draw on to, I think, have some early conversations in his administration. I think his inclination is to reset the relationship between the executive and Congress and try and make things a little bit, bring the temperature down, make things a bit more bipartisan, see if he can find a couple of areas to seek agreement for the sake of seeking agreement. I think that period will be very short. I think this will be, the shortest honeymoon in presidential history, and I think the midterm elections probably start the day the first 100 days end. Today in the news, President Trump is reported as talking about running for president in 2024 and announcing this year. I don't foresee the political season in the United States ending anytime soon. And once that really kicks into gear and the midterms come into focus with divided government and close margins in both houses, I think things get very slow very quickly, and we do a lot of lurching from deadline to deadline after this first 100 days is over.
Yeah, I agree with all that. It kind of goes back to Caroline's point about modest changes at first, and your point. I actually meant to say this in my opening remarks. We're pretty foolish for trying to make predictions about anything in 2020. Anything related to the entire year, much less this campaign. So I admire each of you for being willing to in the ground, and you haven't said anything that I disagree with. I want to come back on a few more specific policy points, but the questions I'm getting from the audience, I think we probably need to put this to rest or spend a little bit more time on it. But it's how serious is this threat from what appears to be, whether it's an outright coup or not, but an attempt to kind of nullify or undermine the democratic process, with protracted litigation, with a lot of rhetoric to suggest that the vote can't be trusted. I think we'd agree that damage is real, but how threatening is this, and how much longer do you think this will go on? I feel like the audience thinks we're not quite addressing that. So I'll offer an initial thought. I'm based in London, and some of my contacts in the American community are in government service, either with the embassy or with the military. And I made a joke, and again, maybe it wasn't too funny, about when we'd see tanks on the streets to a senior military official who's a very good friend, and his kids are friends with my friends, and he doesn't want to be identified, not even by branch. But I said, what is the likelihood if any unit of the military were asked to suppress a protest, maybe a Proud Boys protest that got a little bit out of control, would that be an invitation to bring in the military? And his view was absolutely not, that there's, he said, zero risk of any sort of military assistance or intervention or even, rogue units. But the mere prospect that we're talking about it and serious people are wondering about it is frightening enough and damaging enough. And it is kind of shocking. I don't remember in my many years of being alive that we've had this kind of conversation in any sort of serious context. So just to set stage, I thought I'd go back around again and see if anybody has a different view or some other thing to worry about that we haven't thought of to make sure that we're addressing the audience what seems to be their primary question right now.
So I'll jump in. I guess I tend to view this as the stages of grief, right? That there's denial, and then there's anger, and there's acceptance, and you go through those stages. I mean, this is a unique president who has had a unique relationship with the American people, with the circumstances of his election in the first place, of the accusations that he went through. Like, there's a lot of water under the Trump administration bridge. So my sense is exactly what Carolyn said before, is that he's going to loom over Republican politics, and Republicans are trying to facilitate his ability to get out his anger at the result without sort of giving, at least in establishment Republican circles, giving too much credibility to the underlying accusations that he's making around fraud and the validity of ballots. Senator McConnell had a pretty careful statement about exhausting remedies until the day the election is certified and then moving forward. And I think a lot of elected Republicans would like to stay there. I haven't heard anyone who really thinks that he's not going to go, but that this is an important engagement element for President Trump, and something that he really thinks resonates with his electorate, and why he's ultimately hitting it. It doesn't seem like the cases are having much success on the ground, and a lot of them have been pretty strongly rebuked. So I rely on the strength of our rule of law, but it's a tough moment to have conversations like this, that's for sure.
Yeah. Caroline or Noah, any other thoughts on that?
I was just going to add, I worked on 2 inaugurations and was actually in the Obama administration during a transfer of power, not between presidents, but between administration heads. And I totally understand the fear and what people are feeling right now, and the possibility that something like this could happen. But what happens when someone's position ends and someone else's begins is, like, the infrastructure moves. The Secret Service, the second that the administration head I was working for wasn't administration head anymore, walked out the door. They all at the same time got up and walked out the door. They didn't have a staff anymore. They didn't have a security detail anymore. That person is no longer an employee of the federal government. And that's what's going to happen on January 20th, whether Trump wants it or not.
And I think the only thing I'd add on that is there's one thing stronger than the rule of law, which is math. And I mean, these margins of victory are, not, while they're less than 1%, they're still tens of thousands of votes. So it's not like, even invalidating lots of ballots, which isn't even happening in this. I mean, it's a testament to America's counties and states that they have been able to turn this around despite obstacles put in place by state legislatures to prevent counting, and lots of ways to have people that aren't able to access the ballot, which is, at the end of the day, more Americans than ever showed up and they voted, and lots of people voted for the president, and more people voted for President-elect Biden, and at the end of the day, that's how it's going to play out.
Well, I agree with everything you've each said. No, I just want to echo a comment you made earlier, and I saw the same Twitter thread, and I think it was hundreds of threads, retweets long, or additions long, on all the things we thought wouldn't happen with Trump, starting with he would never get the nomination. So we're wise to assume that he may not come to an abrupt conclusion anytime soon, and some of our assumptions may not be valid. I want to get into some more specific policy areas, but I was somewhat remiss in not addressing, sitting here in London, kind of an obvious question too, and that was the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, his special relationship with Donald Trump, and what that means for Brexit. And he's certainly under a lot of pressure now as we rapidly approach the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union with no real clear deal in mind. I just wonder if any of you have any views from, especially sitting in Amsterdam or the Netherlands, a European perspective on that. And that might be something that comes up in the next panel as well, but I thought I'd give you a chance to weigh in if it's something you have a view on.
So I'll jump in here. I tend to think that America...
You got to keep the beer moving. I was just saying, you got to move the beer.
Yes. So no. I mean, I tend to think that America doesn't want to see either Europe or the United Kingdom holding the bag. Certainly, the Biden administration is going to have an incentive to maintain strong relationships on both sides of the channel. And I mean, President-elect Biden has some unique long-term institutional relationships with all of the players here, and oddly, a very strong personal relationship in Ireland, where some of the bedrock issues are taking place. So I think you could see a much more assertive tone from the administration in a much quieter way in terms of how that assertive tone is delivered. And I think that'll extend to a lot of transatlantic issues where Biden tries to be a much quieter but more productive force in some of these discussions and help mediate some of the rough edges. I question whether there will be a noticeable change in the national relationship between the U.S. and the UK as a result of the transition, even if the personalities maybe aren't the same. I mean, that's a long-term historical relationship, and I think that the UK's made its determination on Brexit, and it's not, it's moving forward on that, and President-elect Biden's going to deal with that as it stands. But
any other views on that before I move on? Well, I'm going to combine a couple questions from the audience because I think they're following a similar theme. A few questions of just, and it echoes what you were talking about earlier, Noah, just the extreme division of views in the United States right now, and how can we possibly bridge or have everybody pointed in some sort of similar, non-combative direction. And then what kinds of actions or words can we expect from President-elect Biden to move us in hopefully somewhat more unified pathway. So maybe I'll rephrase the question slightly and ask each of you to respond. How would you grade the Vice President? The President-elect, we've already decided he doesn't even get a honeymoon, but how would you grade his initial actions and words so far, and what do you think it signals about how he intends to handle the time between now and the inauguration and his first few weeks in office? I'll start with you, Caroline.
Yeah, I think a couple things stand out to me. One is he's already rolled out his transition website. He named 4 priorities on it: coronavirus, the economy, but also climate change, and then the 4th one was racial inequality. I think that he fully understands the divisions that showed up in the election, and it is for sure going to prioritize them in his agenda. The other thing I'll say is Biden is an extremely middle-of-the-road presidential candidate, which is going to, honestly, was probably one of the few people who could have won this election in this moment against Trump, in my opinion. And I think that the fear that one of the questioners had about him being able to introduce policies that speak to Trump voters is not a fear I have as a progressive. I actually think he is he is going to do that quite well. I think that he is a person who has tendencies that are conservative and liberal, and will bridge that divide very well.
Yeah. Noah?
Yeah, I think he's doing something that we would recommend to all of our clients that we're doing media interviews, which is he's blocking from the Trump distraction, and he's bridging to what he wants to talk about. And I think, like I said, he's launched his website. He's holding forums with experts on coronavirus. He has a task force. He's moving on. And I think his team has rightly calculated that they will not be able to control President Trump, that any amount of decorum or deference to the president-elect will cease to exist, and that they're going to have to basically respond in kind. And I think the more time that they spend trying to, fight over whether they're getting the presidential daily briefing or they're having access to office space, stuff like this, that's out of their control. They may choose to go to court to force the GSA or others to move along the transition process, but they're not going to do that and go out and have a press conference about it and really hammer on it. I think that will be sort of behind the scenes thing, but they're going to focus on these issues because I think they do recognize that they want to capitalize on the two special Georgia elections, as well as a coronavirus stimulus package, whatever it might be. It's not going to be by fighting over votes in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, good points. Justin, anything to add?
I think Noah said it well. They're kind of block out the distractions. I think he's done a really good job introducing himself post-election to the American people. I really think that President Biden is going to be very interested in building as much of the appearance of comedy as he can in the city, and will focus an inordinate amount of time on symbolic measures that show the functionality of the United States government coming out of the transition. Institutions are something that's very important to the man, but he's also uniformly known in Washington, D.C. as one of the really good guys coming out of Congress. He's not a big ego politician in terms of the accomplishments. He likes to be associated with success, and I think that he's very well situated to driving that in the early days. I agree with Carol. I think he's uniquely suited to the moment.
Yeah, I that's well said too, and I agree with. Once again, I agree with each of you. I want to put one last question to bed around the drama, because I think that's one thing Trump has been masterful of, is getting us to, turning this into this reality TV series where we keep focusing on, in my mind, maybe the wrong things, but it's still the thing that occupies our imagination. So, who do you think is going to be the one to tell him it's over and to hang up his boots? Just quick lightning round. I'll start with you, Noah. Who gets that duty, or who does he listen to in the end for that one?
Wow. Honestly, I don't think anyone. I mean, it's not like he's been tempered by any of his chiefs of staff, and I think that Mark Meadows has shown incredible disregard for health and safety and public welfare and anything. So it's not like that's who it is. He's removed, he's removed his Secretary of Defense. I don't think for this. I think rather just to continue to muddy the waters and stuff like this. And so I just, if Mitch McConnell is going to come and say something to him, I don't think that's going to sway it any more. And I don't hold the influence of his cadre of family members in very high regard around helping him on that. So I think he's going to have to reach it in his own lonely thoughts. But I also think that he's, and many of his, you mentioned about, militias or other people coming out to the streets. I mean, I think there is a contingent of people who are violent and dangerous, but for most degree, these are a lot of Twitter trolls, including the president, who, once they lose a lot of this, the air comes out and the confidence around it disappears. So I'm sorry, I meandered on there too long, but I don't think there is anyone.
It's a fair answer. Certainly not anyone that can be fired by him, at least. So any theories, Caroline or Justin?
I would quickly say that I think he already knows, and that's why he's already talking about re-election. But if anyone has to kick him out, I think it's going to be the women in his life. I think between Melania and Ivanka, they're going to get him out the door.
No Sean Hannity picks? I'll go with Sean Hannity.
He may be the one to break it. I think I would go with Caroline too. And actually, it's a good transition to what I think I have neglected to mention so far, and that's another historic implication of this election, and that was the election of Kamala Harris as vice president. Obviously, the first female vice president, first African American vice president, first Indian American vice president, and frankly, just given the trajectory of time, in a good position to become the first president of each of those characterizations. So maybe we spend a little bit of time, talking about what the importance of that is and how that, plays out in the political landscape over the coming months and years. And I didn't tell you I was going to ask you that, but it came from the audience. I think it's a great question. So I see you smiling, Caroline. So maybe I'll start with you first, if that's all right.
Sure. Kamala is an incredibly impressive politician. I think she's going to be a fabulous vice president. In the role of vice president, it's a largely symbolic role. Historically, I think that for her it may be a little different just because she is incredibly capable and that they are really largely preparing her to be the next presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. That being said, I think she is. We'll see if this plays out this way. My concern is that she may be pigeonholed a little bit into roles of representing women and people of color and those things, which is not an area that she actually has ever put herself in, fighting for those issues. And so we'll see kind of how that plays out. I imagine there may be some frustration on her part of being the face of women and people of color in the U.S. when she really just wants to be the president.
Yeah, very good point. Justin, any thoughts?
Yeah, so two thoughts. One is I'm really interested. Kamala Harris is an incredibly capable politician. Like the things that she did in California and the moves that she made coming up in California, like really demonstrate that she's both a good retail politician and then also a really good structural administrator. It'll be interesting to see a vice presidency where the vice president is the energetic connection to a certain portion of the president's base. Typically, the vice president is an adjunct to the president's base. I would argue that Kamala Harris really filled out the Biden base with that selection. I think if you look at the consolidation of Biden's support, that was really the linchpin to the whole thing. I mean, on a more personal note, I have a 6-year-old daughter. And about a week before the election, we sat down with her and we're telling her about Kamala Harris. And the day after the election, when we told her that there was a woman who was the vice president of the United States, I finished work and she was downstairs playing with her friends, pretending to be Kamala Harris. So this is a woman whose mere presence in the job that she holds is going to be transformative for millions and millions and millions of women in the United States and around the world. And it's something that moms and dads everywhere should be grateful for because it's going to empower a whole new generation of women to imagine what is possible for their lives and their careers in the public sphere. And I will always be grateful for her achievement in that respect.
Yeah, very well said. No other thoughts?
As a child of the West Coast, both California and Washington State, I think it's great to see the balance of power switch back that way. And I mean, it's not since Reagan that we've had somebody the president or the vice president from California or the West Coast. I think in particular, there were a number of serious issues that California specifically faced in the last few years, from climate change and wildfires to some of the other challenges that have been out there, even on stuff like Uber, and then obviously significant Silicon Valley companies and their role in elections, their role in hiring policies, their role in activities. And so I think as she's represented California at the state level for quite some time now and has experience both in law enforcement but also from representing their constituents. I think, as Justin said, she was a fabulous politician and represented the state very well and advanced competing interests as her time as Attorney General. But I think California is an often overlooked, taken for granted state in terms of two senators who are wisely Democratic and going Democratic in presidential election, but you haven't really had somebody sort of bringing that to it. And so I think it's also an opportunity for Governor Newsom to fill that seat and an interesting challenger on that, and then possibly with Senator Feinstein maybe leading before her term's up, having two opportunities to fill in that. So I think you'll see a lot of change in California politics.
Caroline, you had your finger up.
Yeah, I mean, after having gone through this round of responses, that it is notable that, like, how maybe not historic it is that she is all those things that you started the question with, right? I think for us, President Obama being the first Black president was an enormous moment for our country's history. This one kind of went by. And I've heard more from dads with young daughters, honestly, about the impact that it's had on them and their daughters, which is amazing and will have an impact for generations. But I think that it is it's encouraging for me that it is not as big of a deal that she is a Black woman with Indian heritage in office.
Yeah, that's well said.
It's sort of only unique in the United States, which is another oddity of the whole thing, right? You see Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and Europe has a long history of female leaders, and we're the last dogs at the ball on this one.
Any guesses what you think her first big portfolio assignment will be? I mean, just for example, Vice President Pence was handed the coronavirus response, and we'll kind of see how that's gone. Would that be something that you put somebody of her capability in front of? I know we're just guessing right now, but this is going to come out sooner or later, more quickly than we might expect.
I think he's going to keep coronavirus close to him. I think it's a really important issue and one that he sees a real leadership opportunity on. I'm actually not quite sure what she's going to lead on yet. A former client of ours is her chief of staff, and she has told us nothing. So I think it's a surprise to me.
Yeah. Any guesses, guys?
I have no idea. I don't think she's ever been a single issue politician in her career that I can think of. I think that there's some work at the Justice Department that I could imagine her being quite involved in as a former attorney general and a really capable lawyer. But I don't know. I think she'll have her pick of portfolio assignments once this administration really gets settled. She's probably their most capable messenger.
Yeah,
I think it'll be interesting to see in this time between now and the Georgia special election whether her or President-elect Biden spends more time on the ground there. I think there's obviously a complex political calculus that goes into how much you want to expose yourself to special elections that aren't necessarily balanced towards your favor, but I think both of them will obviously be drawing forces for Democratic voters, but possibly turning off some of the people that are already voted for the Republican Center Summit.
Yeah, fair point. I keep forgetting about this this next boot left to fall with the special election, which I think is probably looming more largely than I appreciate. Zooming out a little more widely, and this isn't even just really a political question, but there was a lot of talk, especially during the outbreak of coronavirus. I'm sitting in London in our second lockdown, about this signaling the end of globalization, and there were a lot of policy initiatives, not just in the U.S., but almost worldwide, veering us back towards protectionism or a more inward-looking perspective. So I wonder if does this election and a new administration does it pivot us back? Was that a valid assumption? Do we pivot back to globalization, or do we find some some in-between perspective, some philosophy about how we look at our role in the world? Justin, you got an international portfolio. What do you think?
Yeah, so I guess it's two different things. I would say that the forces that underline globalization are probably unstoppable. The integration of communications internationally, that you can be in London and I can be in Amsterdam and Noah can be in the United States and we can all be talking together, seeing one another, I think makes certain elements of globalization inevitable irrespective of policy. I do think that the coronavirus showed some supply chain issues that a lot of governments are going to be concerned about. I think that there's some real international big power competition that's going on in terms of how resources are allocated and sort of your great power type of competition that's going on, and that's going to shift things. I think where you see a big difference between the Biden approach and the Trump approach is that the Biden approach will be sort of allies out. So as opposed to America first, I think that it'll start from a position of organizing traditional United States allies around an agenda that fits these macro geopolitical needs and tries to build a coalition around an agenda that works for a larger group of them. I see less of the zero-sum game mentality of an individual country, and I think that the tone will be a lot different. There will be a lot more diplomacy in American diplomacy, even when the message that we're giving is one that our colleagues may not want to hear about a particular issue.
Right. Fair point. Noah, Caroline, anything to add there?
I +1 all of that.
Yeah, I think I'd just say that I think coronavirus was just something that further pushed down the issue, and I think we saw it with the response in the stock markets and the futures industries to the vaccine news, as that globalism is here to stay, and that while the virus has kept people apart and limited business, just the smallest hint of that rolling back, I think, paired with the Biden election, gave a lot of hope to businesses and consumers around that.
Yeah, I agree with everybody. I would just add, my hope is that we will take a longer term view, and as Justin said, we will have to be serious about some supply chain issues that are undeniable, but hopefully we'll recognize the power of collaboration, public-private collaboration across sectors, and definitely across NGOs and kind of respected international institutions. Hopefully we'll see those return to the fore, and I think they'll be needed more than ever. So I'm hoping this is just part of a bigger move back towards a more sensible, sane reality. I think we probably have time for one last question for each of you, and it's got two parts. One of them, and I'll see if you agree with the statement, and if so, why or why not. But that statement that I've been given is, it looks like Biden's not going to be able to do much given the current layout. So what does that mean for his reelection prospects? I can't believe we're already talking about that. And the second part is, who do you think's lining up? Let's confine it to the Republican side for a 2024 run, on the assumption that it's going to be whoever, when Biden takes the reins, it's going to be a hard start to any presidency, just given the economic headwinds and the fact that the pandemic is at its worst in the U.S. now than ever before. It's going to be a tough job. So can he get anything done is question one, and who do you think is already polishing their spurs and thinking about testing the waters for 2024? And I know that's insane that we're asking that, but it is actually a valid question. So Caroline, I'll go with you first.
Yeah, can he get anything done? I want to separate out policy and politics a little bit here, because I think what we saw under President Obama is you can get a lot done and people may not realize it. And so I think the opposite is going to have to be true for Biden. He's going to have to figure out how, even despite getting very little done, he can show a big impact. And so he's going to have to really choose things that are very visible and tangible, and then really make sure that people know that he did those things. Obama struggled a little bit in that regard. After the 2009 recovery, he and his administration did some incredible investments around the country, but if you ask people about it today, a lot of people don't see him as responsible for the economic recovery or all parts of it that happened after that, and they don't feel like they were personally benefited from it. And so I guess that's my advice to Biden is that he's going to really need to figure out how to be visible with limited options. 2024, I think it's going to be a mess, but
we can all agree on that.
I think Trump, yeah, I think Trump Jr. is going to be a formidable candidate, unfortunately. But and then probably everyone who ran this last time on top of that.
Yeah, fair points. Anything to add, guys?
So I agree it'll be a crowded stage in 2024. The Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, Lindsey Graham, Ted Cruz group in the Senate, in addition to one of the family Trumps, is probably the odds-on favorite. Caroline's dead on. I think if Joe Biden wants to be seen as having accomplished things, he's going to have to pick one theme and work it really hard. And I tend to think that'll be responding to the coronavirus and economic investment.
You might have frozen a little bit, Justin, or you're
and put it home over a period of time. You can have an impact and be seen as having success.
Fair points. Noah, any additional points there?
Yeah, I think it's where the president can operate unilaterally. So I think reversing the harm, improving relations with foreign government partners. I think there's a decent amount of space there in the executive branch, and I think sort of improving the way that America is looked at and sort of reducing this tax that some American businesses were paying internationally by, not having sort of the value and faith of the American government behind it. I think that can help a lot. And I think the only person I would add would be former Governor Ambassador Nikki Haley to that list, and I think that could have an interesting dynamic. She has obviously very interesting appeal from her time as governor, and obviously was very successful and ran good margins in her campaigns as well. So I think that could really have a change to electoral dynamic too.
Yeah, good point.
Oh, good call on that one. She'll be on the list for sure.
Definitely. Well, we're just about out of time. I hope I didn't railroad you into not being able to say everything you wanted to say, and I hope to our audience I didn't twist your questions too far in our favor. I was trying to get to as many as we could. I saw a few that we missed, but I think they're going to take more time than we have right now. So in a moment, I'll turn it over to Jacques and have the second part of the conversation with a more focused look at implications for the Netherlands and for Europe. But let me say thanks to each of our panelists. I've done a few of these, and they're so much easier when you've got a well-informed, articulate, interested, passionate panel, and we certainly had that in abundance with the three of you. I hope that if you get bored with your current roles, you find a new role in the incoming administration, because I think you'd have a lot to offer. But in the meantime, I'll say thank you for your time and for your generosity with your experience and expertise. And I'll thank our audience for their great questions and patience as we each work through each of the questions. It is, Justin, you said this when we were kind of rehearsing before. It's an amazing prospect to try to summarize what has happened and what might happen. But I think you guys have done an excellent job, and I'll look forward to staying in touch with each of you to see how the next few days and weeks and months transpire. So I'll let you get on with the rest of your days. I'm going to listen in as best as I can and turn it over to Jacques to introduce the next panel. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thank you very much, everyone.